Well, as far as drugs becoming a part of American culture, they've always been a part of American culture, but not just American culture, culture around the globe. And that's one thing that I'm learning. I've been in this isolated place of law enforcement for many years, pretty much shut off from this knowledge. And whether we're talking religious reasons, ceremonial reasons, drugs have always played a role in culture throughout the world. Now, most of that has been in the natural form, if I might say. The natural state of mushrooms, the natural state of a particular plant, it hasn't been synthesized into a specific drug. Now, the United States has become king when it comes to synthesizing drugs from plant matter into something more powerful and potent. And I think that's the uniqueness of the United States and its attraction to and dependence upon drugs once they have been synthesized. We have kind of like gotten away from the natural state of drugs. Native Americans, okay, they were known for using particular mushrooms, peyote, during their religious ceremonies as they seek awakening, or looking into a different dimension or realm in their ceremonial practices. But we, Americans, have now become addicted to mind-altering substances at a new level, a more potent level, a synthesized level. And I think that's one of our major problems. Yeah, we depend on them quite a bit. I, for one, like the caffeine in my coffee. Knowing that we like our drugs here in the United States, in that there's nothing you can do to move us away from that. It's part of our culture. To make drugs illegal, to prohibit them when there's such a high demand, is a very bad place for us to go. We've been here once before with alcohol prohibition back in the 1920s, and it was a disaster. Now, alcohol, according to every study that I've ever seen, is the most socially problematic drug of all time. It creates more harm in our society. It's abused by more at higher rates. Extremely problematic. However, in 1933, after only 13 years, we ended alcohol prohibition because of the crime that was generated, the corruption that followed, the power and control that it gave to organized crime. Al Capone and Bugsy Siegel. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was about alcohol prohibition laws, not the fact that people drank alcohol. And so our grandparents said, wow, this is a complete disaster prohibiting alcohol. Let's end it. And we did so. And here we are now, decades later, beginning in the 1970s, we started prohibiting other drugs. Don't get me wrong, we've had 100 years of drug prohibition in this country, but we really didn't get tough on drug prohibition laws until the 1970s under Richard Nixon. You see, that's when he bribed local law enforcement with federal dollars to get into the drug prohibition game. So whether we're talking marijuana, heroin, cocaine, meth, and some others, local law enforcement now came into this and started arresting people at high numbers. It's been a complete disaster. Crime levels continue to soar. Addiction rates continue to soar. Overdose death rates have tripled in some of our communities across this country at the moment. And there's no turning. Under these current set of policies, there's absolutely no way we're going to turn the corner. We have to go and move towards regulation and control of these drugs, basically legalization. I support the legalization of drugs, or maybe I should say the re-legalization of drugs, because the prohibition of drugs has failed dramatically. It never worked. If we're going to be talking about reducing crime, disease, death, and addiction, it never worked. It actually made things worse. It's actually counterproductive to public safety. So from a law enforcement perspective, what I mean by that is when you prohibit these drugs and drive it underground into a lucrative criminal marketplace, where those who are managing these drugs fight each other with guns and murders and intimidation at all levels, it makes our communities more dangerous than what they normally would be. So that's what I mean by when I say it's counterproductive to public safety. With that, then we have to send the police in. And how, to manage this. So what we're trying to do is manage a public health problem with criminal justice solutions. So we send the police in. What do? What we do, we make arrests. We lock people up. We initially started arresting those who were selling, those who were bringing it, smuggling it into the countries, and we're setting up their businesses and selling it on street corners and in these gangs and organizations. But then we had this bright idea, why don't we go after the demand side? That's the users. That's the people who are addicted. And we started locking those people up in high numbers, in greatly high numbers. And now we've got mass incarceration at unbelievable levels in this country, higher than any other country on the planet. A complete disaster. So we know, as we do the research on this, we know that blacks and whites use and sell drugs at virtually the same rates. However, that picture does not translate over to how we enforce these policies. So what I mean by that is we're arresting blacks at higher rates. We're convicting blacks at higher rates. And blacks are getting higher sentences for the same crimes. A white person will do 4 years, while a black person does 6 years in prison for virtually the same crime. And regarding these drug laws. Now, so what does that mean? Well, some people say, well, we enforce, we have stronger enforcement in black communities because of the crime that's associated, the violent crime in the black communities from the illicit drug trade. And there's a point to that, because in the white community, even though there's just as many drugs, the method of selling and navigating that marketplace is usually indoors among friends and family and coworkers and so on. And they have the space in which to do that, the private space in which to do that. In the black communities, there's not a whole lot of private space. Most of the drug dealing is done out in the open, on the street corners, no longer by word of mouth, especially since we broke up these major drug organizations and we have so many smaller crews and gangs on our corners selling drugs. And drug use is more out in the open, much easier targets. So when we in law enforcement need the numbers to justify federal grant dollars, the numbers being arrests, where do we go for them? We go into the black communities where those arrests are easy and plentiful. Not only that, in the black community, in those poor communities, there's no political capital, there's no financial capital, so these people have no power to push back at law enforcement and government. War on drugs and tough on crime. A big part of this problem is politics. So let's go back to the 1970s with Richard Nixon. He was dealing with a couple of issues back then. He was dealing with the Vietnam War, and he was dealing with a strong civil rights movement in this country. And Michelle Alexander wrote a wonderful book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in Time of Colorblindness. And in that book, she makes reference to one of Richard Nixon's closest aides commenting on something that Richard Nixon had said at one time. He says, the real problem here is the blacks, and we have to figure out a way to deal with that while not appearing to. So we were getting into a place where you couldn't persecute people for the color of their skin, but you can always go after people for what they do. And so, again, you could go after blacks for being involved in the drug business. And unfortunately, in the 1970s, when businesses started leaving the cities, And those jobs went with it. Those jobs were going overseas, and many of those jobs were being held by blacks with not that high a level of education. They had to do something. Drug trade was available, so they went into the drug trade. Politicians knew this, like Richard Nixon knew this, so they could go after that. He was also dealing with the Vietnam War and the protesters. What did those protesters like to do back in the 1960s and 70s? The flower children, they loved dropping their acid, they loved smoking their marijuana, and Richard Nixon could also go after that group of folks with these same set of laws. He got double for his money, literally. And so it became, this huge, starting with him going into the 1980s, in every administration, they've had this huge advertising campaign on getting tough on crime, which meant getting tough on drugs. And Richard Nixon says, he called drugs public enemy number one. And now you, as a citizen listening to that, public enemy number one, dangerous drugs, well, I'm with you on that. Let's go after them, you know? And we, the blacks, we bought into this. Many of our black leaders bought into this because, yes, we saw the devastation of addiction in our communities, but we didn't realize that the criminalization of our community would be even more devastating. Tough on crime, tough on drugs. This whole thing of our so-called drug problem in this country and linking it to being tough on crime and the fear that comes with that within our communities, mainly the white community. It's one hell of a marketing campaign. When you hear the term drug dealer today, and it's not just the perception of the white community. Many blacks have the same perception because of this wonderful marketing campaign through the media and through the government over years. When you hear that term drug dealer, what image pops in your mind? Young black male, maybe with his pants sagging a little bit, maybe his little cap turned to the side, maybe a little hoodie on. This, and we've even used the term of predator, young urban predator. And when you think of that term drug dealing, you get this image in your mind, what's next? That he's toting a gun. And I'm going to be real with you here. Our young black males, some of them have done nothing to help this image. When you see these images, they taking pictures, you know, and they're squatting, they got the cash on the ground, and they got the 45 or the semi-automatic, you know, there, and the guns, and you know, and they're posing for these pictures. We've done nothing to help that image. So whether it's the government, whether it's mainstream media, whether it's our own young people presenting and carrying this image on. People are now frightened of every young black male. They see this as every young black male. And not just the white community is now afraid, you know, as a young black male, maybe who just got home from college, he's walking down the street, and you'll see people cross the street to go to the other side so they don't have to confront this young black male because of this image, this fear. It's also among our policing ranks. Our police officers believe the same thing. So we treat these young black males differently when we interact with them. And before you know it, after we do this for so long, so many times, you end up with an Eric Gardner, you end up with a Tamir Rice, you end up with a Freddie Gray, and someone loses their life. So a big problem here is how these drug prohibition laws have affected policing. And let me begin real quick with what policing is supposed to be about. The police are the public and the public are the police. We're supposed to be part of the community. That part of the community who is dealing with violent crime. People victimizing other people. Murder, rape, crimes against our children, domestic violence. burglaries, robberies, and so on. But when we started getting into the war on drugs, when we were literally hijacked by the war on drugs, bribed with federal dollars to come in and enforce these policies with a political purpose is what it was. It's now become 70 and in some places 80% of what we do, what the police do in communities, mainly black and poor communities. We clear corners, we arrest those who are using. Those who are using break into cars, they break into homes to finance their addictions, to manage their health problem, which is really what it is. It has distracted us away from crimes of violence. And you can see this difference. In the 1960s, we made 9 out of 10 arrests for murders. Today, we're only solving 6 out of 10. Same rates for rapes and robberies. We're not nearly as effective today in solving violent crime as we were 4 decades ago. We've got technology, we've got DNA, we've got so many resources at our fingertips, but yet we're getting worse. It's because we have been distracted. We also think that when we make these arrests and send people to jail and into prison, that our communities are safer. These institutions, these prisons, they're not colleges and universities of higher learning. They're places of learning. Oh yeah, they are. Learning how to be more effective in committing your crimes. But not only that, when we send nonviolent people into prison, as most of these people are, when we initially send them, arrest them and send them to prison, they will return to your community. But they will return more violent than when they went in. Because in prison, you have to learn how to be violent. You have to learn how to protect yourself. You may have to become part of a gang or a crew for protection. And then when you come back to community, now you're on parole and probation, you have to repay that gang or that crew and put in work. Now that you're saddled with an arrest and a conviction, who's going to hire you for a job? Virtually no one, except the drug trade. So it keeps you in this vicious cycle of violence and drug activity. And because that continues to snowball, as we make the arrests, send people to prison, they come back out, they have to stay in the game. They recruit young children from schools. They become part of the game. Now we're sending them to prison. And it's this vicious cycle of prison, back out, recruiting new employees to the corners from our schools to sell drugs. And we're doing nothing to stop this cycle. It just continues to grow. This population of now disenfranchised young black men continues to grow, and the violence along with that. And if we don't end drug prohibition, it will continue. And in all of that, our neighborhoods become more and more dangerous, and our families become more and more disenfranchised and fragmented, to the point now where families don't even, the typical family model doesn't even exist in many of our neighborhoods. And so with the zero tolerance policies that we've seen in like Baltimore under the leadership of Mayor Martin O'Malley, then Mayor Martin O'Malley, where in 2005, in a city of 620,000 citizens, we made 108,000 arrests. Now, some of those arrests were of the same person over again, but still, I don't think there's any other city in this country that has experienced such a high rate of arrest in 1 year of its residents. And that's what you get with zero tolerance policing, again, as a result of drug prohibition policies. That's where policing has gone. And in this place of zero tolerance policing, the police get frustrated. It's a very dangerous place for them. They start mistreating people. The citizens get angry. It's gotten to a place now where we're not just going after the people who we know to be involved in criminal activity. It's easier to just stop everybody. You're in a line of sight, you're walking, in a certain neighborhood. Okay, let's stop you. We'll pat you down, see if we find a gun. If we don't, we'll send you on your way. Stop you, pat you down, see if we find a gun. Oh, we didn't find a gun, but we got some dope. Let's lock you up. Let's squeeze you, see if we can get some information out of you. That's the normal course of business in cities like Baltimore today. And the citizens have had enough. But it continues to go on. This is the pressure that law enforcement is under now. And before you know it, you're going to end up with a bad scenario, someone pushing back, someone trying to protect their rights, and then the police push back, and before you know it, you've got a shooting, you've got someone dying. Zero tolerance policing also we've seen this in New York City. And under these policies of zero tolerance policing, I think in New York City we know it as stop and frisk, okay? Where of all the people, and this is where some of the disparity issues come in. Of all those people, these thousands of people who were stopped in New York City year after year after year, 86% of those people were black or brown people. 86% of tens of thousands of people who were stopped. And this is one of the dangers of that type of policing policy. We've got to get back, we've got to unhandcuff the police from this type of enforcement. Racial profiling, we've been trying to solve this issue of racial profiling for how many decades now? But you don't hear people talking about the foundation of it. The foundation of it today are these drug policies. Why are we stopping so many black and brown people? Because we're looking for dope. Public enemy number one, according to Richard Nixon. Let's not dump all this on Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, the first black president. Really? And even our current president, unfortunately, Barack Obama. And yes, the Bush father and son team. Every administration has claimed to get tougher and tougher. Yeah, so in Baltimore here, one of the examples I can point to regarding the problem of policing these drug policies at the level of which we're doing it is Anthony Anderson and his death. When he was suspected by the police of being involved in illegal drug activity, the police approach him and tackle him. I believe they put him in a bear hug and take him to the ground in a manner in which they're not trained to do, which results in his death. A direct problem of police enforcing these policies. Excuse me. And the pressure we're under from the higher ups to go out here and make these arrests. I refer to it as incentivized policing. So here's what I mean. We evaluate our police officers according to how busy they are. Unfortunately, we do not equate their busyness to success. It's just being busy. What is being busy? It's making arrest. It's not about the quality of the arrest. It's just about a hash mark. Okay? The easiest arrests to make by far are for drugs in the city because we have a large number of our citizens who use drugs. Easy to find them. Incentivized policing. So, as a police officer, if I make enough arrests, I can make detective. If I make enough arrests, I'll get a good evaluation, I can get promoted. If I make arrests near the end of my shift, I can get some overtime. Incentivized policing. So that's at the micro level of the police officers working on the streets and how they can benefit from it. And at the macro level of making all these arrests, that's how we get, as a police department, that's how we get federal funds. And there's also civil asset forfeiture, where if we suspect you of being involved in any kind of criminal activity, drug activity, we can take your cash, we can take your car, we can take your home, we can take the clothes off your back if we want to. And there is nothing you can do about it. Oh, we say we will give you an opportunity to come into a courtroom and explain to us, prove to us that your cash and your property is innocent of being involved in any criminal activity. But what does that mean? Is that true due process? No, because you have to take time off of work. You may not have that time to take off of work. You may have to hire an attorney. You cannot afford an attorney. There's so many barriers that prevent you from having due process to get your property back. But it's legal. It's all legal. And we don't have to prove anything. The law allows police to use whatever force necessary to gain compliance when someone's disobeying their orders, not following their orders. But those orders have to be lawful orders. And one of the problems that we are seeing, not just here in Baltimore, but across this country, is that sometimes the police don't actually know the law. They don't know the extent of their powers. They think that anything they tell someone to do is a lawful order, and that's not true. So not only do citizens need to know their rights and the law, the police have to know the law and how far they can go in ordering someone to do something. And some of the key things here are, number one, you'll hear these phrases: reasonable suspicion and probable cause. Reasonable suspicion, as a police officer, and me performing my duties, is me having enough information and facts and knowledge where I can articulate that there's a great possibility that you might be involved in a crime or had been involved in a crime. So I can now stop you, detain you long enough to further that investigation just briefly, so I can make a determination as to whether or not you were in fact involved or are not, and then I'll let you go. That's reasonable suspicion, and that's legal. Then probable cause is me having enough information and facts where I can make an arrest, take you into custody. Now, if during any of that I give you a lawful order, then yes, I can use whatever force necessary to complete my task. And if that's an arrest from probable cause, that's an arrest. But if my order is not lawful, if I don't have reasonable suspicion, if I don't have probable cause for that arrest, then my order is not valid. Therefore, the force that I use then becomes illegal. So if I don't have probable cause to arrest you, but I arrest you, then that's an illegal arrest. That's an illegal detention. That's false imprisonment. Let me comment on that. So I want to make just one more comment on probable cause. Back in 2005, in the city, when we made 108,000 arrests under the leadership of Martin O'Malley, many of those arrests, it was somewhere on the other side of 20%. Probable cause for that arrest did not exist, and those people had to be let go with no charges preferred. The ACLU then sued Baltimore City because of that. That's a huge problem from zero tolerance policing. Now, for perspective, Baltimore City made tens of thousands of arrests where 20%, there was no, according to the state's attorney's office, there was no probable cause for that arrest in the first place. The closest jurisdiction to that was Prince George's County during that year. And their rate was somewhere around 2%. 2%? 20%. Big problem. And every other jurisdiction in this county was below 2%. Jobs need to be available. People have to eat. People need places to live. And in order to have a place to live, you got to have money for rent. You got to have money to buy a home. If you're going back and forth to work, if you're all lucky enough to find a job and going back and forth to work, you got to have transportation. You got to provide for your kids. Baltimore used to be a place where jobs were plentiful. We had industries. We had Bethlehem Steel. We had a shipbuilding industry. We had General Motors. We had Western Electric. And people who had high school educations, or even lower, could find a good paying job. It's not the same today. Jobs have been outsourced. There used to be 1 million people, close to 1 million people in this city. Every one of these row homes that you see today that are boarded up, and there's thousands of them, they were all occupied. But it's not the same today. There's one industry that has always been booming. And it doesn't matter whether or not you had a high school diploma or college education. It doesn't matter whether or not you got a criminal record, as many people do because of our over-enforcement of these drug laws. The illegal drug selling industry will hire anybody. And when you are desperate, when you are hungry, when you want a roof over your head, you will do what you need to do. When you need to provide for your children, you will do what you need to do. And if it's selling drugs, it's selling drugs. Until we deal with the root issues here, we're going to continue to chase these symptoms of violent crime, these symptoms of overdose deaths, these symptoms of problematic policing, these symptoms of corruption, until we deal with the root issue of policies of drug prohibition. We're going to be here decade after decade after decade chasing these symptoms, dealing with large numbers of murders, robberies, burglaries, zero tolerance policing as we try to wrap our arms around this issue of violent crime. Until we take the money out of this illicit drug trade, we're going to be here year after year. It's like the elephant in the room. It's like trying to vacuum this living room with this elephant standing in the middle of it, but no one wants to move the damn elephant. You're never going to clean the room. Nobody wants to talk about this issue. But not one person will say that the war on drugs has been successful in reducing crime, disease, death, and addiction. Not one. Everybody agrees that it's been a failure. Police, clergy, politicians, community leaders, they all agree that the war on drugs has been a dismal failure. So what are we going to do about it? So far, we've done nothing. So the correlation between drug prohibition, the war on drugs, and mass incarceration is this. In 1970, every year we were making about 415,000 arrests for all drug-related crimes. It's less than 500,000. By 2005, we were making 1.9 million arrests for all drug-related crimes. Today, I think we have somewhere around 2.3 million people in prison, most of which are in there for drug-related crimes. Just over 40% are in there for non-violent drug-related crimes. The United States is 5% of the world population. We have almost 25% of the world's prisoners, mostly for our drug enforcement policies. The war on drugs has turned the United States into the largest jailer among any country. We've even turned it into a lucrative business. We have private prisons that have been born out of this. We're arresting so many people and jailing so many people that we got to hire the private sector to manage our inmates. Corrections Corporation of America, the GEO Group. A couple years ago, Corrections Corporation of America divvied out $675 million in dividends to their shareholders. Oh yes, I said shareholders, because you can invest on Wall Street in bodies, mainly black bodies being behind bars. And that should not be acceptable in this country, which is supposed to be the land of the free. If you look at any major city across this country, by far, the people being arrested, the largest number of people being arrested in jail are for drug crimes. And most of those arrests are for nonviolent drug crimes. And as I said before, you send a nonviolent person into the halls of our prisons, they're going to return to your community a violent person, because they have to protect themselves while they're in there. And they have to learn how to become violent. They either become predator or prey. You decide. If you were arrested and sent to prison, what would you decide? Will you be predator or will you be prey? I don't think anyone's going to make that decision, conscious decision, to be prey. Unfortunately, there are still people in this world that think that you could have a drug-free society. There are people in this world, unfortunately, in this country, who still believe that you can keep these drugs from coming into this country. Well, I mean, think about this. Our most secure places in this country happens to be our prisons. But we can't keep drugs out of prison. There's not one drug-free prison in this country. So we have to learn how to manage drugs. We have to learn how to live with drugs safely. You can't eliminate them. Right. And a lot of people who do sell drugs do have jobs. A lot of the people who sell, because when you've driven it underground and made it so lucrative because you prohibit it, you can make so much money in such a small amount of time with very little effort, that people with jobs sell drugs because they say, I'll get in, I'll make some money, I'll get out, I'll take that money and I'll do this with it, I'll do that with it, turn it into a legitimate business. But once you get in there and you start making this money, it's very difficult for people to get out. So they keep on going, they keep on going. And usually one or two things happen. Either the police catch up with them eventually and now arrest them and saddle them with an arrest record and criminal conviction, which makes the rest of their life difficult, or violence will catch up with them. I remember interviewing this one young black man who has turned his life around, one of few, because it's very difficult to do. He ended up doing some time for dealing drugs in Baltimore City. He had his crew. He was bringing in a lot of money. The people working for him weren't getting paid that much, but he was making a lot of money. He gets arrested, spends some time in prison, and he comes back out. And so I'm talking to him about this, and I said, so how did you deal with the violence? What was that like? You know, the violence of that drug trade in Baltimore City as you were managing your crew on this corner. He says, believe me, Major, he says, I wasn't looking for no violence. He says, but you get into that business, the violence finds you. It finds you. Because the nature of that business is that people want what you have. And what you have is that corner, is that marketplace. And if it's a good corner where you have where you're making a lot of money, those neighboring crews want your corner. Violence will find you, whether you're looking for it or not. And that's because of the illegality of the business. Now, if you bring it above ground, regulate it and control it, things change. We don't see beer distributors Coors and Anheuser-Busch having drive-by shootings and running gun battles in our streets? No, because it's above ground, it's illegal, it's alcohol, which is legal, but yet one of the most problematic drugs of all time. But we don't have the crime associated with it. Well, so when people ask me about legalizing, wouldn't that be a disaster with heroin and so many people would be using it and cocaine and this, that, and the other? The first thing I do is I ask them a question. Two. First question is, do you use heroin? It's either a yes or no. Typically it's no. Second question is, if it's legal, would you use it? Would you? No. What makes you think you're so much smarter than the next person? You see, if you want to use it, you're already using it. You're already using it. It's speculation that if something is made legal, and when I say legal, I mean regulated and controlled. I don't mean that you can walk up to a machine and put a few dollars in it and have dispensed to you a pack of heroin. I mean, maybe through a pharmaceutical model. If you have an addiction issue, then it's managed in a legal way. There's so many different models in which you could do this that would protect children. And let's talk about children. Let's talk about the current model of managing heroin. Prohibition, which results in how many heroin outlets do we have in Baltimore City right now? Tell me, how many? And this is kind of like the conversation I would have with them. How many distribution points do we have in Baltimore City for heroin right now? Tell me. Legal? No, just distribution points. Because this is the whole thing. If we're talking about a legal method versus an illegal method, and prohibition versus legalization, we're talking about access in protecting our children. So currently, under models of prohibition, you don't even know how many access points you have in Baltimore City. But I can tell you one thing, it's thousands. It's thousands. Second, what kind of control do you have over these access points? Are they following regulation? Quality control measures? Is there a regulation as to who they can sell to? How old do they need to be? Do they have to display a license? We have thousands of young men and women on these corners in Baltimore City selling heroin to anybody who has cash, anybody who wants to buy it. Not only that, these businesses, these companies hire children to sell. They recruit kids to sell because kids are easier to manage, they don't want much, they cost a whole lot less. That's the current model. And under this current model, let's talk about overdose deaths. How many are we having? Are the numbers going down, staying steady, or are they going up? They're going up. So if you think our current model is such a great model, with everything that I just explained to you, and the industry is being managed through murders and intimidation, kidnappings, fear, seizing neighborhoods at times, if you think that that's such a great model, then let's continue with it. Or if you think that we should have a system where heroin is regulated, where we know how many distribution points we have because they have to register, they have to get a license. Okay, there's going to be quality control measures, so we know what the purity level of heroin is that's being sold. We know that it's not being laced with anything that's going to be more dangerous than the heroin itself, like fentanyl and some of the other cutting agents, that they will have to follow regulation and guidelines where they can't hire children to sell heroin to other children in our schools. Children are locked completely out of the game. If you think that having this regulated system which eliminates the violence, the murders, the kidnappings, and the witness intimidation and everything else that comes along with that, if you think that that's a better model, then let's do that. But understand that there's no such thing, and never will be, as a drug-free community. It's all about how you manage it. Me personally, I think that the second model of regulation and control that I explained to you is the best model. Not this free-for-all of drug prohibition, where kids are the primary ones selling heroin and other drugs in our neighborhoods and communities and schools. And we end up arresting these young people and ruining their lives forever. You know, when we look at the black family in our communities, you know, some people think that a lot of the disintegration of the black family has to do with drug abuse. And yes, there's a role there. But when I look back on this over the past 4 to 5 decades, I see the most significant factor in the disintegration of the black family as being our criminal justice system. To be more specific, mass incarceration. We have arrested so many breadwinners of our black family, so many leaders, so many black men within the black family, and started this vicious cycle of sending grandfathers, fathers, and sons, and nephews and uncles into prison. I don't know if the black family in many of these communities will ever repair itself. One of the first things we have to do is end this system of mass incarceration, which sits squarely upon the war on drugs and these drug policies of prohibition. That's the first thing we need to do. We need to sever that pipeline of putting so many young black men into the system. Then once we do that, we need to figure out how we repair the black family. You know, but the war on drugs has obliterated the black family. It's been, I personally think it's been more devastating to the black family than slavery. Now, yes, there were people who would say that, you know, during times of slavery, one of the things that the slave owners did, they purposely separated the black family. But we got to a point where during those final decades of slavery that we were able to really, we started doing a very good job of keeping the black family together. You know, when I think of, I grew up in Baltimore City. When I go back to the 1960s, I grew up in Reservoir Hill. But when I think of all the black communities in Baltimore City, from Cherry Hill all the way up to Reservoir Hill, going up Park Heights, West Baltimore, East Baltimore, we had very strong black family units. And even though we got to a point when these jobs started leaving, being outsourced to other countries, even though our fathers were saying to us, look, I got to go out here and get a hustle to supplement the income, and it may not be legal, but you'll do as I say, not as I do. You'll keep your butt in school, you'll graduate, you'll go to college, and you'll make something of your life. I got to do what I got to do during this time. Even though that was happening, the black family was together until we started the war on drugs, which started the disintegration of the black family in many of our cities. Criminal justice system has been the largest detriment to the black family in this country than anything else. And with our prison system today, you know, it is today's slavery. It is today's slavery. Those young black men incarcerated today and some older black men incarcerated today are making a lot of goods for corporate America behind those bars. A lot of companies are making a lot of money off of those people who are currently incarcerated, making 15 cents, 75 cents an hour for their hard work. That's slavery. Not just the incarceration piece of it, But we can even go to our school to prison pipeline. Let's go. We're looking at the grades of our students in some of these schools in the black community and making a determination from that, seeing how low this group of kids is performing, and then predicting that because of these low grades, we know that these kids this percentage will not graduate from high school. If they do not graduate from high school, that means that they're going to end up in the criminal justice system. If they're going to end up in the criminal justice system, then we're going to need this many beds in our prison. We're predicting this already. So, so from the beginning, from dealing with schools, police in our communities making arrests, our court systems, our prisons, it's all systemic racism. The whole system needs to be redone. But you can't have meaningful criminal justice reform without meaningful drug policy reform. And that's what we're trying to do in this country today. There's a bipartisan effort right now for massive criminal justice reform, but most of the work is being done on the back end. Recidivism, job training, job placement for people coming out of prison, mandatory minimum sentencing reform. This is all great stuff. Don't get me wrong. It's great stuff. It's needed because we have to, work with folks coming out of prison so that they can get on the right track and have an opportunity. But if we don't do something on the front end, if we don't sever the pipeline of people going into the system, we're going to be working on the back end forever. So the pipeline of people going into the system is the war on drugs. It is drug prohibition. So we have to have meaningful reform in that area too.